In the 17th century, the French opened up diplomatic relations with King Narai of Siam. He was actually quite open to the idea, and in fact some Siamese diplomats were sent to meet King Louis XIV of France, and they caused quite a sensation. French diplomats obviously visited Siam, but they weren't initially greeted by the king or some high-ranking Siamese diplomat. Instead, it was a Greek man named Constantine Phaulkon. He had become a favourite of King Narai and rose to be the second most powerful person in the kingdom, essentially the country's prime minister. During his time as prime minister, he would oversee Siam's war with the East India Company and a great deal more. But he didn't just stop there. He also began to use the French to cement his own position and allegedly tried to seize the title of regent for himself. So Constantine was born on the island of Kefalonia around 1647. This island at that time was owned by the Venetians, and his mother was in fact Venetian, but his father was Greek. Constantine left the island as a teenager to travel to England, and there he joined the East India Company and sailed out to Asia. Apparently he was a very gifted linguist, picking up a number of languages very quickly, so he was offered into the services of Kosa Lek, a high-ranking minister and trader. Now Lek's sister was a concubine of the king, and his brother Kosa Pan would become a sensation in Europe as he led the mission to France. Constantine was offered into Lek's service because the East India Company in the 1680s wasn't the powerful force that it would later become, and they needed to find ways to secure trade deals and entry into each country. Inside Siam, various groups all struggled for influence, and one group I find particularly interesting is the Persians. In fact, Kosa Lek had a long-standing rivalry with one Persian, Aku Muhammad Astrabadi. To understand the Persian presence in Siam, you need to keep in mind that for centuries, the Indian Ocean trade was dominated by the Arabs and Persians, and they still trickled east even after the Europeans had arrived. Astrabadi organised the Persian community, which was only around a few hundred people, and he helped Narai forcibly take the throne in 1656. In fact, they weren't the only foreigners to help Narai, as he also enlisted Japanese mercenaries and Dutch East India men. In thanks, Astrabadi was allowed to lead the new palace guard of 500 men, many of which were not Persians, but Muslim Indians, and then he married the king's cousin. Once in power, he sought to undermine the Europeans' dominance in the Asian seas by building a moderate navy and sailing to Macau and Japan. But the courts were filled with plots, and Astrabadi would be accused of corruption, and Kosa Lek rose in the ranks. Astrabadi's sons met with the king's brother, and this was seen as part of a plot to overthrow the king, so they were exiled to Phuket, thus ending Persian dominance in the royal courts. Constantine, on the other hand, had been introduced to the king in 1881 and quickly rose high in the court. There are contradictory reports of how he managed to rise so high in the courts of Siam. Some say that he was a skilled treasurer due to his experience with the East India Company, others come up with stories like he was able to measure the weight of the cannon, or some say that he helped the king create a pyre to cremate his beloved wife. But let's just say that he was a skilled linguist and treasurer. So in 2 years he was able to climb through the ranks, and convinced the king to build a European-style fortress. Lek disagreed with this, but Lek was then accused of corruption and flogged so hard that he died of his injuries. Constantine inside the treasury probably had a lot to do with this, but he didn't take Lek's position right away. Instead that went to Okhya Yang, a Malay who had been an admiral for a couple of years. Thankfully there were a number of people recording events around this time or shortly afterwards. These include Samuel Baron, who wrote letters calling himself the English Catholic, Engelbert Kaempfer, a German naturalist, and various other French and Dutch travellers and explorers like Claude de Bayes. Well, it was the English Catholic who said that Constantine was the real power in Siam. Okhya Yang was just there to allow Constantine to gain more power in the background, and in his words, Constantine, who was then at the peak of his favour, encroached a lot on his authority. That grieved him somewhat, but he endured it to avoid trouble, whilst waiting, like many others, for his rice to cool before eating it. He was patient. Plus, many of the foreigners still just went to Constantine to discuss matters, completely ignoring Okhya. In the meantime, Constantine would also marry a woman of Portuguese, Japanese and Indian descent. She, by the way, is credited with introducing many desserts to Thailand, like Phoi Thong and Tong Yip, many of which she knew from her Portuguese family, but she used local ingredients to make them, and they're still popular today. But like literally any story about the history of food, this is disputed. But going off her complete mix of an ancestry, I think it's a good time to go into a little history of Siam and the foreign groups there. Now, even though I've been calling it Siam, it was in fact the Ayutthaya Kingdom, and they fought against the Burmese for decades. It was during these wars that both sides enlisted the help of foreign mercenaries, notably the Portuguese and Dutch. In fact, a very similar story could be told of a man over in Burma named Filipe de Brito y Nicote. He fought with the Rakhine king in the late 1500s and was made the governor of Syria. His descendants and the descendants of his fellow Portuguese formed their own ethnic group known as the Bayingi. They were later defeated by the larger Burmese Empire, but this mixed race population would be integrated once more into the armed forces. Then of course, as mentioned before, there were the Persians and other Muslim groups who often stopped en route to China, with some of them staying. Then there's also the Japanese, who at this point had closed off their country, but they still had quite a large population abroad. This was in part thanks to their Red Seal ships which carried Japanese merchants across most of Asia, and again, many fought as mercenaries. To give you one example, during the Amboyna massacre, which saw the Dutch massacre the English in the Spice Islands and start the First Anglo-Dutch War, well, a number of Japanese were fighting alongside the English. However, I think I'll do a video on the Japanese Red Seal ships soon. And there was a final group known as the Makassar. They had fled to Siam after the Dutch had conquered their homeland in Indonesia, but once in Siam they too began to plot to take power. They aligned themselves with the Malay and the neighbouring princes of Champa, and then rebelled in 1686. They hoped to remove Narai from power and install a puppet, but Constantine caught wind of this plot and used French and English mercenaries in putting it down. He also personally led these foreign mercenaries in punishing deserters and participants alike. But more than that, now the French and English were in the country, following him and capable of challenging the other groups, like the Dutch, Portuguese and even the locals. Now he had previously worked with the English East India Company, but since leaving England he had converted to Catholicism and began to favour a French alliance ever since they emerged in Siam in the early 1680s. Plus, in 1681 the English factory in the capital had been destroyed by fire. The East India merchants, Potts, Barnaby and White all had different accounts of what caused the fire, and many left Siam shortly afterwards. However, Constantine could have been involved, as a Dutch merchant known as Van Vliet had accused the East India Company of funding Constantine's rise, and the fire destroyed all potential evidence for this. To contradict this, however, many in the company saw him as an interloper, but elsewhere he was seen as a valuable asset in spreading Christianity, and he had supporters amongst the nobility in Europe. Yet everybody agreed he was clearly a remarkably ambitious man. After the fire, the French were free to fill in the space left by the English, and like elsewhere, the missionaries had laid a foundation. These missionaries had organised an envoy to leave for France, which included gifts of elephants and rhinos, but it sank on the way. So Constantine then prepared a second embassy in 1686, having secured his position in Siam after the Makassar rebellion. Kosa Pan was the Siamese ambassador, and his team stayed in France for nearly a year. They carried a letter from Narai in a butzebok and presented it to King Louis. They also came with a number of gifts for the French to secure an alliance, and these included a couple of cannons, which revolutionaries would steal when storming the Bastille. Many paintings were also made of the embassy, and it created a bit of a stir in the fashion world, as French nobility began to adopt new clothes in the Siamese style. The French then sent a number of missionaries to try and help convert Narai, especially after they heard rumours of Persian missionaries trying to do the same. So the race was on to try and get Narai to become Christian or Muslim, but as Narai said, no king had ever been known to adopt a new faith, which had no following amongst its subjects. Nevertheless, greater plans were afoot. Constantine and a Jesuit named Pere Fachard used the pretext of a French alliance to send a number of Jesuits into Siam disguised as laymen. Then they would begin to appoint officials and convert the local population, all the while appeasing the king by swearing allegiance to him. The ambassador to Siam, Chevalier de Chaumont, also agreed to these plans in 1687, and over 600 French soldiers and 300 technicians arrived in Siam, and amongst this crowd were the Jesuit missionaries. Once they arrived, these troops quickly occupied Bangkok, which was just a fort at that time, and moved into Mergui. Shortly after this, they signed the Franco-Siamese Treaty, which allowed them to take control of most of the islands surrounding Mergui. But this began to worry the English East India Company, and the merchants White and Burnaby sailed to Mergui in 1687. The Siamese, however, responded quickly and killed Burnaby. But now the governor of British Madras got involved. His name was Elihu Yale, the man which the university was named after. Well, he sent ships back to Thailand, but had to quickly surrender to the French garrison. Thus, the Anglo-Siamese War was underway. However, around this time the king fell ill, and now Constantine was at the centre of attention. He of course had the most power, and as Kaempfer wrote, was put at the head of the finance of the kingdom, and also the direction of the king's household. Almost all public affairs of the most important concern were determined by his advice, and whoever had anything to solicit was obliged to apply to him. Yet the king's illness also meant he lost his chief supporter. Meanwhile, staunch Buddhists and local nobility could see his plans to convert the kingdom and seize power. So they joined together under the leadership of Phetracha, a man who had the best government title I've ever heard of, the Minister of Elephants. Together they started the Siamese Revolution. Constantine was accused of attempting to place a royal puppet on the throne named Phra Pi, an adopted son of Narai, who had already converted to Christianity. Phra Pi was quickly executed, and Constantine was captured himself when he was ambushed inside the palace. Then Constantine was forced to wear the head of Phra Pi as he was marched outside the capital and executed by Phetracha's son, the future king Sanphet VIII. Father de Bèze witnessed the execution, and it was apparently a very brutal affair, but Sanphet would later gain the name the Tiger King due to his pretty brutal acts, like crushing girls to death with his own feet. So the revolution succeeded, and Siam became more isolated and suspicious of foreigners in court. Yet in the 17th century, had things gone differently, we could have had a Catholic puppet king allied with the French, or an Islamic king of Siam. Plus, had the Persians remained influential, maybe those trading ships would have grown in number, and Thailand could have expanded into Southeast Asia. This, by the way, isn't too unbelievable. Oman, for instance, chased the Portuguese out of Arabia, and then colonized Zanzibar in Africa. Then, of course, Brunei had colonies in the Philippines, so maybe Thailand could have done the same. Now my question to you is, can you think of any other foreign adventurers who rose high in the courts of another country? One example I can think of keeping in that region are the White Rajas of Brunei. Leave yours in the comments below.